Hey everyone, Gavin Seim, and it's another Easy Masters video today. We're going to talk about LoFi, or low dynamic range. A few weeks ago, if you remember, I did a video on high dynamic range, but today we're going to look at low dynamic range. And we also did a video recently about contrast and why you should stop using contrast in terms of sliders and things like that. Both of those go great with this one, and I'll put them in the links below so you can check them out. But on this Easy Masters theory, we're going to look at what's kind of ignored as well, and that's LoFi, or low dynamic range. I'm not even going to waste time. We have a portrait here that's out of camera, not high dynamic range. You know what I mean if you watch my HDR video. It's nicely lit, it's a pretty portrait, but it's not intensely in terms of shadows to highlights in particular. That doesn't mean we couldn't edit it as a more high dynamic range approach, but let's take the other option. Let's go to something like just a Portra 400 on this, so we'll get a nice clean film edit out of Filmic, and you could edit this however you want it. A film edit, for me, as I've talked about in my recent videos and articles about Filmic looks, a Filmic look is a great place to start for any editing process. Now, if you look here, when we edit, most of the time, we lift shadows a little or a lot, and we pull highlights. So the more we pull highlights and lift shadows, the more we're kind of creating this HDR-ish look, which frankly kind of starts to flatten this out, right? We start to push everything into the midtones. It doesn't look particularly bad, but what happens when we go the other way? Now, a filmic edit, a good film simulation, like my portrait look here, is actually really accurate. And this has a good dynamic range. Negative films had great dynamic range, but they're not pushing things way up and way down. They also had rich shadow, something I talk about a lot in my live shadow hackers workshops. And you can find the next one of those as well from the link in the comments. And they're free. Subscribe, hit the bell icon, and stay tuned to these, because this whole Easy Masters series is taking really complex theory and making it simple. Okay, before we continue this edit, let's look at a couple examples. If you take a cyanotype look, this I did in my Emulsion 4 actions, where I create my platinums and my cyanotype looks to get those authentic looks. And you see there's, in a cyanotype, if you've looked at these kind of blue cyanotype images, oftentimes they have these kind of lifted shadows. That comes from these early darkroom processes where you didn't have super dark blacks on the papers and in the processing and in the capture. A lot of times, these have kind of crushed down highlights, but also lifted blacks. You'll often see this in platinum type processes. If I'm trying to mimic a platinum process like I do in Emulsion, I want those shadows to be rich. I want those shadows to be dark, maybe even darker than the original photo. But if you go back to the contrast topic, low dynamic range actually has more contrast most of the time than a high dynamic range. If I were to go to a Polaroid, right? When I'm shooting like Polaroid SX70, I really like shooting it, but it has terribly low dynamic range, right? So between the sunlight on the face and the shadows, the exposure is all over the place. So I can take and I can shoot a Polaroid, but I have to be really, really careful about the lighting conditions. So you'll sometimes see me showing my Polaroid shots, and you can see that they tend to have really white whites and really dark blacks. And if you do those correctly, they can be really gorgeous. Sometimes they kind of have different tints to them. Some batches are more black and white, and some batches have more kind of almost a platinum-y, wet platey kind of feel to them. Now, we can recreate low dynamic range in a digital edit, of course, and it can be really useful, because in a world where we're always pushing these sliders all over the place to get more dynamic range, it can actually be really important to have less dynamic range. I'll put links in the description to some free presets that you guys can try this out yourself on, as well as links to the different videos and the live workshops and things like that. Let's come back to this edit I did with Portra. Okay, so we have a nice film edit. It looks good just as it is. And you can see that highlights are pulled down and shadows are lifted a little bit. What if I zero those out, right? So this is native. Now we have a little bit more of a contrasty image. We can see when we pull the highlights down, we're kind of smoothing out the face. But as we push the highlights back to a more light area, and we actually reverse the shadows, so we darken the shadows instead of lifting them, look what's happening. We're getting this kind of lower fi, not an extreme, but it actually at times looks a little bit more organic and film-like. And so you can do this in a lot of different ways. For example, in my ModKit presets, there's actually a hi-fi expansion and a lo-fi expansion. So an HDR-ish expansion and a low dynamic range expansion. You can see here, there's more highlight and shadow recovery, whereas lo-fi is going reverse of what you would normally do. So this is the thing. We get in these ruts of how we're supposed to use these sliders. Oh, always pull back your highlights and lift your shadows. That's a good formula for a general purpose preset because it kind of gives you a balance, right? But you notice here that if I do a lo-fi version, and this is not an extreme lo-fi preset mod, but I could apply this on anything. And of course, you could do this manually by adjusting the sliders yourself. What you notice here, though, is that in lo-fi, the portrait actually still looks really, really good. We're actually creating naturally a little bit more organic contrast. So not contrast like a slider, but we're coming back to the contrast that was captured in camera. That's creating a more lo-fi look, but in a very natural way. Contrast is the separation of dark and light, sometimes the separation of colors. Contrast is like you take your warm body and you get into a cold shower and it's kind of startling. It's contrast between the warm and the cold, and it's really not so different in a photo. So a photo without contrast becomes mush. Now we can take this to extremes, of course. Let's look at that. This originally I did a black and white edit with it. If I go to my silver presets and I use my Jungle River preset here, you can see I get this really contrasty black and white. So there is lift in the shadows and pull in the highlights. There's dynamic range, but because of the way the curves are in this, there's a lot of rich shadow and we're lifting the highlights. So even though there's shadow and highlight recovery here, I've kind of done a lo-fi look on this to create this really stark black and white look. This lo-fi-ish look in black and white can actually be really important. And oftentimes photographers make the mistake of trying to do more of a high dynamic range, crush highlights, lift shadows in a black and white. And what they end up with is an image in black and white that relies so much on contrast because there's no color to create the contrast, and they end up with an image that's very flat. Look what happens if I delete or reset the curve here in Lightroom, and all this applies if you're using Capture One or anything else. Let's reset the channel here. Look how flat it is here. There's nothing wrong with it. Okay, now let's reset our highlights and shadows. All right. There we go. It's not bad, but it lacks a little bit of contrast. What happens now if I put a pin in the middle of the midtones and down here? So let's lift our shadows. Let's make our shadows a little muddy. We see this a lot in kind of lo-fi looks, right? And then let's lift up our highlights and then pull down the highlights on the end so they're not clipping too much. You can see the more extreme I get with this, the more we get kind of this lo-fi look. And it's very easy to push it what I would generally call too far, right? You kind of start getting this look of an old wax print or something like that. These old papers that had almost no dynamic range, or even a Polaroid, right? A lot of times when I shoot a Polaroid, if I'm not really careful with the light, I will start ending up with this, where the highlights are really pushed hard and don't have a lot of detail, and the blacks are really black. Yeah, I think I'm going too far with this, and more or less the way I did it with the preset actually looks pretty good. But what I'm saying is you can take this in any direction. Don't get stuck in a rut. Remember, your zones, like I talk about in my Shadow Hackers workshop, are there for a reason. Your blacks down at the 0 end and your whites up at the 10 end and your 5 middle gray. Using your tonal range, whether you're doing a high dynamic range edit, you can still take that histogram and use that whole tonal range, or whether you're doing a low dynamic range edit, you can still use blacks to whites. It's a question of how you're mixing the blacks, the midtones, and the lights. Let's look at another example of this shot I did here down in the subway in Zion. I'm gonna actually come and just apply like a Simply HDR preset from Natural HDR 4. Okay, so we get this kind of high dynamic range look. It's balancing out highlights and shadows, but not going too extreme. Now look back in here. You can see that we have detail in the shadows, and we're still retaining detail. Now what happens if I switch that up? Here I'm going for a more high dynamic range look because it fits. Don't mistake having a high dynamic range look with not having any contrast. That's something I explained in the HDR video. I were to go back to my mod presets from ModKit, and here is hi-fi expansion, right? We did this with an HDR preset. I could push it a little more with a hi-fi mod, or the lo-fi mod goes in reverse. Here's a really good example where you see the difference. If I do lo-fi on this, that is to say I don't recover the shadows and highlights. The shadows are super dark and they don't look bad, but our highlights, we kind of start to lose it here and it loses some oomph. Now, I could actually take away my shadow recovery and just do highlight recovery to balance this out, keep my highlights from going too far, and keep my shadows really deep. But arguably, in a scene like this, the more high dynamic range approach is better. There's no rule here. In a world that we're always talking about high dynamic range, we think, oh, if it's high dynamic range, it's good. That's actually not true at all. Having high dynamic range can be very good. Having low dynamic range can be better. Having a camera that captures a lot of dynamic range in camera, of course, is good because it gives you more to work with in your raw file. Something you don't have, for example, if you shoot a Polaroid. But that doesn't actually mean one's better than the other. And low dynamic range, or LoFi, tends to get kind of ignored as just a cheesy effect where we lift the shadows. But it's actually a very filmic inspired effect and goes back to the darkroom days and is very important. If you look at this portrait here, where I had sunset light that was pretty strong, my subject was really heavily illuminated here with deep shadows. So even though there's quite a bit of dynamic range in the scene, unless we really push the highlights and the shadows, we kind of have this low dynamic range scene. And you can see if I really pull back my highlights or lift my shadows, it becomes too much. The recipe I use from silver presets to just get a balanced portrait preset with nice skin tones, deep shadows, etc. actually works pretty good here. We have really deep, dark shadows down here that are almost kind of lo-fi in nature. They're even lifted a little bit, but you can see they're not actually clipped. We're not clipping the highlights or the shadows. We're using from about zone 1 all the way to about zone 8 or 9. So if I balance everything out and crop and maybe do a little lift and a little tuck here, I'm going to end up with a very contrasty photo that actually works well. Let's take the other side of that with the same model. If I look at this portrait here, you can see that I have a lot of light kind of hitting the bars of the window. Again, this is like a portrait mix, and I'm using the defaults. If I went lo-fi, that is, I took away the shadow and highlight recovery and went in reverse, you can see that her face gets very dark and the bars get very bright. Whereas if I do the more hi-fi approach, we lift light into her face and we balance out the highlights of the bars. Are you seeing where this is going here? Low dynamic range is actually just as important as high dynamic range. And we need to get out of this mindset and stop thinking, oh, I have to make high dynamic range. I have to do high dynamic range. And I'm not talking in any of these cases about bracketing or stacking images or anything like that. I explain in the HDR video why that's not actually what makes a high dynamic range photo. What we're getting at here is that having a low dynamic range mindset helps you hunt shadows. I don't start an image editing from zero, just moving sliders around, because I know I'm going to get much more options and creativity if I use my presets. And this rings true whether you're creating your own presets, downloading my free ones from the site, or you use my pro packs. It doesn't matter. If you're going through and you're mixing those recipes around, it's going to help put your mind on track. It's going to give you grounding. Let's look at one more. This is a Velvia 100 look from Filmist again, and you can see that it's very nice. It's balanced, it feels filmic, but I could go the other way, right? If I pulled the shadows down a little bit and pushed the highlights up a little bit, not too far, you can see that compared to the baseline, it actually makes those darks darker and those lights lighter, but not in a bad way. We're making the image lower lower dynamic range. And by the way, yes, you could also do this with the curve, push the highlights up and pull the shadows down. Bear in mind, it's very easy to go too far. Using the curve requires a little bit more time and nuance. Again, why you always see me building these complex curves into presets, because just moving a teeny tiny bit on your point curve can be very powerful, but look how quickly I can start to push too far on those tones and it starts looking very digital, blown out, and unnatural. It doesn't look filmic at all. Once you start shadow hacking and you start seeing the nuances of this stuff, pretty soon you get out of this rut that digital has put the industry in, and you just start controlling both the highlights and the shadows, the lo-fi and the hi-fi, to get exactly the look that you want for whatever project you're working on. And that is a very liberating feeling. If I mouse over the hi-fi and lo-fi presets, this gives us kind of a side-by-side view. Here's the high dynamic range version, not extreme, and the lo-fi version. Both of these actually work. We've just got so used to pushing these sliders far over, and there's nothing wrong with using the dynamic range of your file to balance it out. We have these amazing raw files now. It's fine to use them. It's just important to understand and master all the elements of creating photos in camera and editing in post, that we understand it's not just one side. Lo-fi doesn't equal bad, and HDR doesn't equal good. Low dynamic range and high dynamic range are both very powerful tools that help you hunt the shadows and balance out the drama and the atmosphere in your photos. I hope you guys found this useful. Let me know what you think in the comments about using low dynamic range, and I hope you go experiment with this on your photos, and I hope to see you at my next free Shadow Hackers class, where we dig into the theory of this even more and completely transform the way that we think about light, because it's not actually about the light, it's about the shadow. All right, you guys, we'll see you soon. Peace.